Let me, on behalf of my colleague, the Honorable Minister of State for Works and Housing, Honorable Nclhud, who is also representing Nigeria outside of the country, and on behalf of the Permanent Secretary and all the staff of the Ministry of Works and Housing, welcome all the commissioners and state representatives, all the invited persons and organizations to this year's Council meeting on lands and housing and urban development. And let me point out that this is the 11th in the series. On behalf of all of us present, let me thank the host state, the host commissioner, and the host governor, the host speaker, the host chief judge, and the host grand caddy, and the government and people of Sokoto State for accepting to play host to us this year. We are really, really grateful and enthused by the decision you have made to host us. It helps us to maintain the balance that we tried to keep when we started, that we must move from one zone of the country to the other as part of our integration, collaboration, and partnership efforts in hosting these conferences and meetings. So I thank you very much, and so also for all of the provisions that you have made. We are indeed very grateful. Let me also, on behalf of the federal government of Nigeria, express our gratitude and to say how pleased I am to report to this meeting that the National Housing Program that was initiated at the onset of the Muhammadu Buhari-led administration is now delivering on its objectives. That program is active in 34 states, about to start in 2 states because of some efforts to adjust the land that was made available in those 2 states. Apart from stimulating the economies of those 34 states where work is going on and construction is being undertaken, providing employment for engineers, for artisans, for builders, and other skilled persons, the construction sites themselves have become and remain centers of supply, centers where building materials are delivered and used, centers where cash is trading, changing hands for the supply of sustenance, and so many other inputs. And this, for me, remains the very reason why commitments to infrastructure have become the template for governments of all levels across the world. As I say to our team, infrastructure is the most legitimate way to distribute wealth in an economy. From the day you sign the contract, so many chain reactions take place. Vendors take position, suppliers take position, people begin to employ, machines begin to move, transportation of materials happen, drivers get employed, and so on and so forth. So in that process, many people who were either too unemployed have had their dignity restored because they can leave home every morning and say to their families, I am going to work. And that is very dignifying. I cannot stop repeating the story of an artisan I met when I visited the Kaduna site a couple of years ago. And he was so enthused and said, I must deliver his message of gratitude to President Buhari. So I interrogated him. I said, what is the big deal? What's going on? He said, Oga, you don't understand. I said, so make me understand. He said before that there was one young lady that he had been eyeing in the corner, but he didn't have the money to marry. But that not only at the work at the construction site kept him going for 12 months or 15 months, he had made enough money to go and meet his beloved and betrothed and to contract the marriage. So, but when we do these things, we don't know how many people will reach, and we don't know how it impacts people. But for that man, it was that project that allowed him to marry and start a family. And that is a good story to tell. So it's not just building a house. He won't live in the house. Somebody else will live there, but the opportunity has impacted him. And so for that change of dignity for the better, instead of begging, when people can get up every morning and tell their families, I am going to work, I think change has happened. And this is part of the change that we promised in 2015. And let me remind you that Governor Tambuwa was part of that change. And Sokoto State has not been left out of that change, because that change also happened here. Governor Tambuwa provided land, we have built, and we have delivered here. And this is why you will see that on the 22nd of March this year, the Minister of Police Affairs represented President Buhari to come and formally hand over the first phase of the units of houses that had been delivered in Sokoto State. So, and across the states, Delta, so many other states, Ekiti, Osun, Niger, Nasarawa, the ministers from those states have been representing the president to hand over those houses. And again, I am pleased to report, with that going on, I say that we are now in a season of completion as we enter the home stretch of our tenure of governance. And this is a good place to be. And for those who are interested in acquiring any of those houses, I invite you to go to the web portal, which is nhp.worksandhousing.gov.ng. nhp.worksandhousing.gov.ng. We have set this up as a transparent process for the allocation of the houses, so that people don't say, oh, we sold it to ourselves, or we sold it to our family members. So there's an open process there, and if you follow that process, as some have done, what you will see is that you will get allocated, and you will pay, and we will hand over in due course when all the documentation is finished. Today, some people who had long dreamt to be homeowners now live that reality as they have become successful allottees in some of these houses. Again, this is change. People who dreamt to be homeowners have now become homeowners. And perhaps one of the most pleasing impacts of this national housing initiative by the federal government is that it has been used by President Muhammadu Buhari to redeem the housing promise that was made to the 22-man squad of the Super Eagles who won the 1994 Nations Cup. For 28 years, that promise was unfulfilled. But the National Housing Program has provided the opportunity. President Buhari approved that all the beneficiaries should pick units in their states of preference. And as I speak, that duty, that promise made 28 years ago by the country to our young athletes then has been discharged by this president. Let me remind you again that if you ask those athletes, that is change. Something that they have waited for 28 years has now happened. but it happened only because we committed to housing. But the National Housing Program is only one of the many initiatives at the federal government level to address our housing needs. The Federal Housing Authority, the Federal Mortgage Bank, are two agencies of the federal government who address different issues relating to housing. The FHA building large estates, the Federal Mortgage Bank addressing the financing side, largely providing construction and mortgage finance. But while that is the story of housing at the federal government level, I cannot ignore the various interventions by the state governments who have sensibly and appropriately deployed their resources to provide housing in their states. And again, our host government and state, Sokoto State, is a good example of that initiative. I must commend the governor for his commitment to housing supply. And let me use this platform to inform the meeting that state governments, where we have built and completed phases of the National Housing Program, can apply to fund or acquire some of those units if they so desire for their residents and their indigents. And we will consider these applications subject, of course, to compliance with these allocation procedures. Of course, whatever the states and the federal governments can do by way of housing construction is just a small dip in the ocean compared to what the private sector can do. The evidence out there shows us very clearly that the bulk of our housing across the world, and our society is not left out, the bulk of the housing is delivered by private sector, by individuals and companies. In this regard, I am again very happy to report a visible increase in the participation of the private sector in Nigeria's housing sector. Many of us will notice now on very many media platforms what we see, what we hear, and what we read about the development of one estate or the other by members of the private sector. And this must be welcome as the footprint of private sector investment in housing occurs in our states. Let us embrace them, let us support them. And so this brings me to the theme of this year's council: housing our people, by all of government and by all our people. The message I intend to share is that housing provision is a collaborative effort by all levels of government and by the private sector. From what I have said so far about what the federal government is doing, what the state governments are doing, and what the private sector is doing, it seems to me that the housing sector in Nigeria is heading in the right direction, even if I acknowledge that there is more work to be done. And it is to that work that needs to be done that I now intend to turn my attention. The first thing I wish to address is that we must all remain conscious that not everybody wants a house built by the government, as there are those who wish to build for themselves. All they ask for is access to land. Let us remember that. And we must give those kind of people the choice. We can build government housing, but more importantly, let us understand that some people want to build for themselves. We must therefore, I propose and counsel this meeting, which is representative of all the states, focus on the process to reform the governance around allocation of land in all our states, and the issuance of title documents such as certificates of occupancy. It is true that the federal government has some land, But when you go back to the land held by the federal government in every part of the country, they were acquired by the state governments and given to the federal government. What I am saying essentially is that the control over land lies with the state governments. It is almost a total control as intended and achieved by virtue of the Land Use Act. I know that some people have argued that, oh, land issues have become problematic and that the Land Use Act should be repealed. I believe that Governor Tambuwa may have entertained or listened to some of those debates when he was Speaker at the Federal House of Representatives. But to those who think that the Land Use Act is a problem, I beg to differ. I don't agree. I believe that if there is a problem at all, it is the way we have administered the law, not the law itself. That is the problem. And let me make this point even clearer. Let us ask ourselves how much automation has come into our land administration process. Are we still carrying the relics that the colonial government left for us? How accessible are land registries? Can people conduct searches online? Can people file their processes online? So if we are doing in 2023 for 200 million people what we used to do for 20, 30, 40 million people 50 years ago, it's not going to be efficient. So, and I'm happy to hear from Governor Tambuwa himself and some other state governments that they have invested money in digitizing their land information systems, and they are already beginning to reap the results. For those states who haven't taken that position, please do so. Go and make the case to your governors. Make the case to your parliament. It is the way to go. It will provide certainty about administration of land. It would help unlock the wealth that is inherent in land administration. I'm sure that the Honorable Commissioner for Housing in Lagos State will tell you that we were able to push these reforms through, and it sits on a very, very important asset today. If you have to be signing CFO one by one, as against doing digital signature, by the time I was leaving office in 2015, I could sign 700 CFO in one day, once I had my iPad with me. So there's a difference, and I think if we all focus on this, we will yield the benefits. One of the things that access to CFO does is that it unlocks access to wealth. That document is money. It enables the holder to access credit, finance, and again, it will contribute to the number of houses that government is building. It will unlock access to cash. If they take it to the Federal Mortgage Bank, it is easier to get credit, or to any other bank. So let us understand this and see the housing beyond just building the house. We must do that. So between 2017 and now, even while we are digitizing the Federal Lands Registry, and we still have to do a lot of things manually, I can say to you today that we have signed over 5,000 certificates of occupancy. We have issued over 2,000, precisely 2,738 applications for consent. So those transactions must continue, and they must happen in quick and record time. They shouldn't take months. They should be matters of days. These are important documents, and as I said, they facilitate housing delivery and access to finance. So I will go quickly now to the other point that I think we should address, which is the issue of rent. Let us also see housing beyond ownership. Not everybody has the income to own a house at the same time. Some people have to rent first before they become owners. Let us redefine that housing concept to include rental housing. And if we do this, what we will see again is that there is a lot of work that can be done at the state level. Because rent is not a matter that the federal government controls. It is not in the exclusive list. It is not in the concurrent list. It's a residual matter for each state house of assembly to intervene. As long as people have to pay rent from income that they have not earned 2 years rent in advance, 3 years rent in advance, when salary is coming monthly in arrears, there is a mismatch. I know that most of the houses that will be impacted by this are private houses. They are not necessarily government owned. And I concede to the owners of those properties the right to legitimately expect that they will get rent from their properties. That's their right. But I still hold the view that asking for 2 to 3 years rent in advance from working class people does more harm than good to all concerned. You know what happens? From the day I pay that rent 2 years in advance, I'm doing everything to recover. I will pass it to my own services. I will pass it to my transport. I will pass it to my bills as a lawyer if you become my client. I will pass it to potato and yam and pepper in the market. And you know what happens? The cost goes around. Think about it. Have you interacted with people at close quarters when rent is due? And the anxiety, can we take that away at the state level? Honorable commissioners, speakers of houses of assembly, think about this. It can happen. My offer is to use this meeting to challenge us to look at rent, how to make it easier for our people to pay. The economy and our people will be in a much better place if we can do it. It will be highly revolutionary when working class people can pay their rent when they receive their salaries. I think that it is possible if we try. And in my opinion, this will give the fullest meaning and the fullest expression to the theme of this meeting, which is housing our people by all of our government and all of our people. All of us can do something. Thank you for listening.